On October 14, 2022, a cold front swept through Brookhaven, New Hampshire, the kind that made the air feel sharp by nightfall and sent people looking for warmth in the most unlikely places. That night, 17-year-old Mason Rourke told his parents he was going to a movie, a late one, something niche, obscure. It was a last-minute plan, he said, part of a pop-up screening advertised on local forums, a lost horror film called The Mirror Room, supposedly banned by its university for being too disturbing, too real. Mason had found the flyer stapled to a telephone pole behind the school. Black paper, white font, no contact info, just the name of the film, the location, and 3 words beneath it: one night only. The Majestic Theater wasn't the kind of place most teenagers went anymore. It hadn't shown a mainstream film since 2009. The building sat hunched behind an abandoned strip mall, its marquee letters cracked and rusted, with faded posters peeling behind dusty glass. But on that particular Friday, someone had pried the heavy doors open and switched on the old neon sign. According to other attendees, mostly film students and self-proclaimed horror junkies, the theater was buzzing by midnight. Tickets weren't sold. Instead, you gave your name at the door and were told which theater to go to. Mason's name was listed. He was assigned to Theater 3. It was the last time anyone saw him walk through a doorway. By morning, Mason's parents realized something was wrong. His bed hadn't been slept in. His phone calls went straight to voicemail. They checked social media. No posts, no messages. Mason wasn't the kind of kid who vanished. He was shy but predictable, often more comfortable behind a screen than in front of people. He didn't party, didn't experiment, didn't sneak out without checking in. His mother texted him 8 times between 9 a.m. and noon. No response. They called the police by 3 p.m. An officer arrived at the Majestic that evening. The place was locked again, the marquee dark. The inside was cold and musty, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the seats. Theater 3 still had a faint chemical odor, possibly from old film stock. In the far left row, under a broken armrest, they found Mason's phone. The screen was cracked at the top corner, likely from impact. When examined, it was still open to the camera app, recording nothing but a tilted black screen. It had been running until the battery died sometime that night. No blood, no signs of struggle, no scream, just an empty seat and a device that had kept filming long after Mason was gone. The detective in charge, Lieutenant Rhonda Tierney, initially treated it as a voluntary disappearance. Teenagers ran away more often than most people realized, especially in small towns. She issued a regional bulletin and checked Mason's social media accounts. A few strange horror forums came up, places where people debated the legitimacy of banned films, underground screenings, and psychological conditioning through cinema. Mason had posted a few comments there, mostly about narrative theory. Nothing alarming, nothing that screamed intent to vanish. But his parents disagreed. They described the days leading up to his disappearance as unusually quiet. Mason had seemed distracted, watching old reels on his laptop, scribbling notes in the margins of old film books, taping black paper over the corners of his room. His mother thought it was a school project. His father thought it was a phase. Neither suspected this would be the last time they'd see their son walk out the door. A week after Mason vanished, investigators spoke to several people who had attended the screening. They all told similar stories. Theater 3 was playing something strange. The projection was flickery, the audio disjointed. Some said it gave them headaches. Others thought it was just an art film with bad formatting. One detail stood out. Everyone remembered the reel running for exactly 47 minutes. No credits, no announcements, just static when it ended, and the ushers quietly ushering them out. But no one could confirm seeing Mason leave. When detectives requested security footage, they discovered that the theater's surveillance system had captured everything, until 12:03 a.m., when all 6 internal cameras cut to black. The outage lasted 47 minutes, the same length as the reel. By the time footage returned, the lobby was empty. When pressed, the property owner claimed he hadn't authorized any screening. The building had been leased under a temporary event license by a company that didn't exist. The paperwork traced back to a shell corporation dissolved in 2017. Phone numbers disconnected, emails bounced. The flyer, printed on a home inkjet printer with no batch codes. The horror community began to whisper. The mirror room, they said, had always been cursed. Some claimed it had been banned in the early 2010s after inducing seizures during a campus screening. Others said it was the project of a disturbed student who disappeared after a fire destroyed the university's media archives. Conspiracy or legend, no one could prove where the film came from or where it had gone. But Mason Rourke had walked into that theater. And after 47 minutes of footage no one could trace, he never walked out. Detectives returned to the Majestic Theater the following morning, this time with a search warrant in hand. They wanted more than just a walkthrough. They wanted names, timestamps, any trace of what had happened in those missing 47 minutes. What they found instead was a fog of vague recollections and conflicting accounts. Theater employees, a skeleton crew of 2 ushers and 1 projectionist, admitted they remembered checking Mason in. He came alone, no one with him. He gave his name at the table, was handed a small printed slip that read T3, and quietly walked toward the auditorium without speaking. But when asked who saw him leave, the room fell quiet. No one could say for sure. One usher recalled watching the crowd exit, but admitted he had stepped away to help with a soda machine jam right before the credits would have rolled. Another said she thought Mason left with the rest, but couldn't remember what he was wearing. The projectionist never saw him at all. The names had come from an RSVP list taped to the counter, now gone. The only potential witness was a girl named Simone Aldridge, a freshman at the local college. She had posted anonymously on Reddit the night of the screening, describing the mirror room as nauseating and completely wrong, saying she'd gotten up 10 minutes in and left because something about it made her skin crawl. She remembered walking past Mason. She'd seen him before around town, but when pressed, admitted she didn't actually see him leave. She just assumed he did, like everyone else. Detectives pulled the building's internal security feeds, hoping the static rumor about the 47-minute blackout was just urban paranoia. It wasn't. At exactly 12:03 a.m., all 6 cameras, the lobby, both entrances, and the 3 theater hallways cut to pure black. No transition, just static. That blackout lasted until 12:50 a.m., when the feed suddenly resumed mid-frame. Investigators confirmed the timestamp matched the film's alleged runtime. The abrupt outage had no technical explanation, no power surge, no circuit blowout, no tampering. The security system had simply stopped. When a local technician inspected the DVR unit, he noted the feed wasn't analog. It was digital, encrypted, and independently powered. The footage during the blackout wasn't deleted. It didn't exist. The cameras had never recorded anything during that window. Theater 3, the room Mason had been assigned to, was sealed that afternoon. Crime scene tape across the doors. Forensic techs combed the room for trace evidence. Blood, hair, fiber, anything. They dusted for prints, ran luminol across the carpeted aisles, even removed ceiling tiles. The results came back clean. Too clean. No fingerprints on the door handle Mason would have used. No food wrappers, no gum under the seats. It was as if the room had been prepped, scrubbed, or never fully reopened at all. The projector system was even stranger. It was a hybrid model, a digital interface connected to a classic 35mm rig. The film reel, if it had existed, was already gone. No case, no film boxes, no evidence it had ever been there, except for the unmistakable residue of nitrate-based chemical oils still faint on the ventilation ducts. Nitrate film hadn't been used legally in decades. It was volatile, dangerously flammable, and extremely rare, especially for an underground horror screening. Theater 3's interior gave off a faint chemical odor like old celluloid. A technician noted the screen surface had faint warping near the center, as if something hot had been projected too long in one spot. That kind of damage didn't happen in a single showing unless the film had been stopped mid-frame and held there. Burn in. The room didn't just host a film. Something had lingered on that screen long enough to leave a mark. News spread fast. Within days, forums dedicated to analog horror and found footage were flooded with posts about the mirror room. People claimed it was real. Others said it was an elaborate ARG. But a common thread emerged from the noise. Whispers that this wasn't the first time the film had been shown. One user shared an archived post from a university horror board dated 2011. It mentioned a short film screened in a campus sub-basement that left 3 students hospitalized with seizures. The post claimed the film had no narrative, just flickering reflections, distorted sound, and whispers layered into the audio. Another commenter recalled waking up hours later with no memory of the film at all, just a nosebleed, and the faint memory of staring at their own face. Only it wasn't moving like theirs was. The thread was deleted 3 hours after it resurfaced. Investigators reached out to the university mentioned in the post, Wexler College, a small liberal arts school 2 states away, but were told no such incident was officially recorded. There was no record of a film called The Mirror Room in the school's archives. No students hospitalized in 2011 from a screening. But former students who reached out privately to Mason's family said otherwise. They remembered it. Not the story, the feeling. One man, now in his 30s, said the film made him feel like his thoughts were being spoken before he had them. Another claimed he had recurring nightmares about seeing his reflection walk away from him in a theater lobby. As the noise swelled, Mason's disappearance transformed from a local tragedy to something stranger, a digital myth in the making. His photo was now plastered across Reddit threads, Discord servers, YouTube explainers. People argued whether he'd staged it for attention or been recruited into a performance cult or lost in some psychological experiment gone rogue. But Mason's parents didn't care about theories. They cared about their son, and all they knew was that somewhere, during those 47 minutes, something unexplainable had taken him. As theories spiraled and the digital noise around the mirror room reached fever pitch, one name kept resurfacing: Ezra Lamb. On obscure forums, film preservation threads, and horror subreddits that traded in urban myth, his name appeared like a glitch in the background of an unsolved equation. At first, he was just another lost name in a tangle of speculation, supposedly tied to a decade-old student project that was said to have caused psychological harm. But the more investigators looked, the more solid he became. Lamb wasn't fiction. He had been real, and he had vanished long before Mason ever stepped into Theater 3. Ezra Lamb had been a student at Wexler College in the early 2010s, enrolled under the school's experimental media studies track. According to archived enrollment records, he transferred in from a different program and quickly gained a reputation as both a visionary and a recluse. Professors described him as obsessively creative, someone who spent more time in the film lab than in class. He rarely spoke in seminars, but submitted projects that were technically brilliant and thematically unnerving. Several of his short films were pulled from student showcases without explanation. One professor remembered a project titled Through the Wall, composed entirely of mirror reflections edited to suggest the protagonist never existed. It was never aired. Another faculty member recalled Ezra once arguing that cameras don't record time, they record memory trying to disguise itself. Lamb's academic career came to an abrupt end in October 2012, when a fire gutted the lower level of the university's media archive building. The blaze started late at night, and though there were no fatalities listed in official reports, Ezra was never seen again. His dorm room was found empty, stripped of personal belongings, with only an 8mm projector humming on his desk, running an empty loop. The assumption was that he'd perished in the fire or fled before the smoke cleared. The university quietly closed the program a year later, citing liability concerns and lack of student interest. But the rumors didn't die. When detectives traced the footage blackout from the Majestic Theater to the exact runtime of the alleged Mirror Room film, Ezra's name returned with new urgency. He hadn't just been tied to the original project, he was rumored to be the original director, and if that was true, then he was either alive or someone had access to his work. The FBI's cybercrime division became involved after an anonymous tip flagged encrypted traffic tied to the IP address of a known file-sharing platform used by experimental filmmakers. A user operating under the handle VoxEcho2 had posted months prior about a restored cut of a film that would prove memory is filmable. The language wasn't academic. It was cryptic, philosophical, tinged with obsession. In another post, Vox Echo 2 referenced shutter-based recall calibration, a phrase not recognized in conventional psychology or film theory. But the timestamps were damning. The last post under that name was made 3 days before the Majestic screening. Digital investigators began scraping metadata from archived threads. They traced one post to a public library terminal in western Vermont. Another bounced through a campus Wi-Fi router in Massachusetts. None were definitive. Each one stopped just short of revealing a real identity. But when investigators examined the images occasionally attached to the posts, blurred screenshots of film strips, distorted frame stills, mirror patterns spliced with timestamps, they noticed something else. A small watermark in the corner of one frame. Lamb 12. The resurfacing of that watermark was enough to push the FBI into deeper territory. They began looking into the group that had hosted the Majestic screening. On paper, the event had no organizer, no official rental contract, no insurance filing, no social media pages. But one name surfaced more than once in whispers: the Threshold Collective. It sounded like a myth, the kind of name you'd see in ARG threads or performance art hoaxes, but there were traces of it in old university event logs. One such event had been flagged in 2014 as potentially cult-related after participants reported memory gaps and dissociative episodes. No charges were filed. The question investigators began to ask wasn't whether Ezra Lamb was alive, but whether he had ever really intended to make films at all. Or if the films were just a means to something else, something buried beneath narrative, beneath entertainment, something closer to control. Back at the Majestic Theater, analysts re-examined the chemical traces found in Theater 3. The nitrate residue wasn't just old, it had a signature specific to a batch produced in the late 2000s for academic use, before safety regulations tightened. That same batch had been shipped to Wexler College in 2011 for one student's senior thesis. The name on the materials request form: Ezra Lamb. Mason's disappearance, once treated as an isolated anomaly, now looked more like a repetition. A second iteration of an event that had been trialed and tested in private, now deployed in public, refined, perfected, and released under the radar of legality. If Lamb was alive, he had evolved, and if he wasn't, someone had inherited his methods. But before agents could verify anything further, the message boards went dark. Dozens of threads referencing the mirror room vanished overnight. The Vox Echo 2 account was deleted, not archived. And the original flyer for the Majestic event, the black paper, white text, no contact, disappeared from every forum where it had once been reposted. Only the watermark remained, a ghost signature in a single still frame, traced back to a man who'd burned with his film over a decade ago. Or so they had thought. The forensic sweep of Theater 3 yielded no fingerprints, no signs of struggle, and no physical trace of Mason Rourke beyond his cracked phone. But buried in the hardware, in the wires, frequencies, and forgotten speakers that had gone untouched for years, investigators found something else, something not visible, but audible. It began with a routine check. The department contracted a freelance audio forensics specialist named Tom Vickery, a former sound engineer with 20 years of experience in analog restoration. His task was simple: analyze the playback environment inside Theater 3 and determine whether any malfunctions in the sound system could account for the memory gaps or physical reactions described by some audience members. But what he uncovered wasn't mechanical. It was intentional. Vickery ran a frequency sweep through the room's built-in speakers, mapping out the acoustics and cross-referencing them against known distortions. At first, everything looked normal. Then he isolated a data log from the night of the screening, a feed of the projector's audio output channel. Using high-resolution software, he noticed a subtle low-frequency signal buried beneath the official soundtrack. It was below the threshold of human hearing, around 17 hertz, known as infrasound. That frequency wasn't part of the building system. It had to have been embedded directly into the film's audio track. Infrasound is a strange phenomenon. It doesn't register as sound, but as feeling, often pressure or unease. In controlled environments, it's been known to cause nausea, panic, and hallucinations. Military researchers have explored its use in non-lethal crowd control. Architects know it well from faulty HVAC systems, but in cinema its use is rare, dangerous even, especially when applied deliberately. Vickery enhanced the isolated signal and slowed it down to audible levels. The waveform, when visualized, wasn't a smooth line. It pulsed erratically, almost rhythmic, like breathing, not mechanical, organic. Meanwhile, Mason's phone had been submitted for further analysis after the initial search revealed nothing conclusive. It had died mid-recording sometime between 12 to 10 and 12:20 a.m. The screen cracked, camera app open. Investigators had initially dismissed the file as corrupted, just a few seconds of black screen, no audio, impossible to extract. But with new attention on the sound signature in Theater 3, they sent the phone to the digital forensics lab at Quantico. There, the lab recovered the partial video. It was 6 seconds long. The footage was grainy, unstable, but clearly shot from inside the theater. Mason is partially visible, seated. His face fills the left side of the screen, dimly lit by a blue glow. He appears to be whispering something, barely moving. The phone shakes as if balanced precariously. His voice, filtered, faint, is heard. "I'm still here." But when technicians slowed the clip and scrubbed it frame by frame, something didn't add up. Mason's lips don't move. His face remains still. The voice plays over the footage, but it doesn't match his visible breathing. His throat doesn't tense. There's no vibration in his neck. It's as if the voice was layered into the footage after the fact, or wasn't his at all. At the 2-second mark, the light shifts, and a reflection appears in the far background. It looks like a screen, possibly the theater projection. But instead of showing the film, it reflects Mason himself. Only, the reflection moves before he does. In a blink, the mirrored version of Mason tilts its head slightly. The real Mason does not. And then, just before the file ends, there's a burst of static, a single distorted frame, unreadable, followed by a sharp tone at the tail end of the audio file. When the tone is extracted and analyzed, it matches the same low-frequency hum Vickery had discovered in Theater 3. The audio engineer plays both samples simultaneously, one from the phone, one from the theater, and realizes they match exactly, not similar, identical. It was the same signal running through both the public speakers and Mason's private recording device, as if the signal wasn't playing in the room, but rather through it. In a closed meeting, the FBI concludes the audio track was designed to interfere with cognition, to confuse, distort, disorient. It wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to be felt, then forgotten. Weaponized dissonance, buried just low enough to avoid detection. They begin working backward, searching online databases for any projects linked to infrasound experimentation in film. One archived article mentions a student symposium at Wexler College in 2011, where Ezra Lamb had reportedly proposed a thesis on synchronized fear induction through microtonal layering. The abstract was rejected. The proposal was buried, but a single phrase from the write-up haunts the analysts. If memory can be fractured by sound, then identity can be recorded, not by what's seen, but by what's felt. That night, Mason's mother receives a call from the lead agent. They tell her there's a chance, a small one, that Mason may not have been taken in the traditional sense, that if the audio was meant to disassociate and isolate, there's a possibility he was still inside when the crowd left, confused, paralyzed, misplaced in time, a voice without a body. The next day, Theater 3 is reopened under full containment protocol. This time, they bring silence, no power, no playback, no echoes, and for the first time, they begin to wonder if Mason had whispered, "I'm still here." Who or what was he saying it to? The Majestic Theater had always held a kind of quiet rot, its crumbling brick exterior, its warped foundation, its hidden corners of mildew and dust. But what lay beneath it had never been on any blueprint. After weeks of circling around the missing footage, the corrupted audio, and the vanishing of Mason Rourke, authorities filed for a structural search and excavation order, citing probable cause of concealed space. On November 3rd, contractors drilled into the base of Theater 3, following a faint architectural seam just behind the screen. What they uncovered was not just a storage room or forgotten crawl space. It was something far more deliberate and deeply unsettling. The entrance led to a short staircase descending into silence. At the bottom, a sealed steel door locked from the inside. It took a battering ram to force it open. Beyond it was a chamber approximately 20 feet by 20 feet, encased in thick, outdated soundproofing foam, yellowed, fraying, and embedded with layers of dust. The walls were padded, the ceiling low. There were no windows, no vents, no natural airflow. Just a suffocating stillness, and the faint smell of chemicals and old celluloid. At the center of the room was an 8mm film projector, half covered with a tattered cloth. When powered on, it flickered to life instantly. Someone had rewired it to draw from a hidden battery array tucked behind the wall. Next to it, shelves lined with old reels sat in tight, perfect rows. Each canister was labeled not by title but by date and first name. 03-17-18, Aiden. 06, year 09 and 20, Lila. 08, 22-21, Eric. Most were unlabeled beyond that, but one stood out. 10-14-22, Mason. For a moment, no one moved. The name felt like an accusation, a timestamp paired with a disappearance. One of the officers reached for the canister but paused. It was warm. Not ambient temperature, actually warm to the touch as if it had only recently stopped spinning. The projector had been running something. As investigators cataloged the room, they began to notice details that didn't belong to an ordinary film suite. The floors had track marks, suggesting furniture had been dragged or repositioned regularly. A metal chair bolted to the center of the room had leather straps affixed to its arms, weathered and frayed. Behind the chair, a wall-length mirror was mounted, but when inspected, it was revealed to be two-way glass. The reverse side led to an observation alcove no larger than a closet. It had no exit, only a stool, a switchboard, and a red toggle labeled Loop. The entire space had been designed to control what was seen, heard, and repeated. On the far wall, carved into the padding beneath the sound foam, were words, not written in ink, but scratched over and over into the underlying insulation. One phrase, repeated dozens of times, rehearse fear. Some were jagged, others careful. Some stretched high, others crowded near the floor. It wasn't a slogan or artistic flourish. It was instruction, a command. Analysts speculated that this was more than a filming location. It was a chamber for psychological repetition. A space where someone was conditioned to respond to stimuli in a very specific way, like rehearsal, but not for a performance, for internalization. The reels were transported to a secure forensic lab for inspection. One by one, they were reviewed and cataloged. Most showed hours of single-subject footage, individuals sitting alone, flinching, whispering, mimicking expressions shown on a nearby screen. Some footage was reversed, some looped on itself. Subjects repeated phrases over and over, often while exposed to strobing lights or low-frequency tones. Many seemed unaware they were being recorded. When they finally loaded Mason's reel, what they found confirmed what they had feared and escalated the investigation beyond anything the local department was prepared to handle. The reel opened with a shot of Mason, seated in the center chair, blinking into the darkness, visibly disoriented. A metronome ticks in the background. At first, he appears confused, even drugged. Then, slowly, he begins to mirror his own reflection. He raises his hand, then lowers it, then raises it again. On the third repetition, he whispers, "I'm still here." It's the same voice from the corrupted phone file, but on the reel, his lips move. He says it out loud. Frame by frame, his demeanor changes, sometimes desperate, sometimes mechanical. At intervals, his reflection glitches, a light burst, a color shift, a sharp edit spliced in mid-word. The footage lasts 23 minutes before it abruptly cuts to static. That static, when analyzed, carries the same low-frequency audio signature previously discovered by Tom Vickery. But here, it wasn't hidden. It was central. Blared, looping. The FBI elevated the case to a federal-level psychological operations investigation. The basement, now dubbed the Loop Room, was photographed, sealed, and classified as evidence in a potential interstate criminal scheme. But for Mason's parents, the discovery didn't bring closure. It brought horror. Their son had not simply vanished. He had been studied, recorded, and conditioned like a subject in a lab. As the agents prepared to transfer the reels, one technician spotted something else. Beneath the reel canister shelves, a trap door. Its hinges were rusted, sealed shut, but the officers marked it for immediate excavation. Because if the loop room was a stage, there was a chance something else, or someone, had been left beneath it. The film reels taken from the loop room were transported under armed escort to a federal media forensics lab in Quantico. Their contents were treated as both evidence and anomaly, each tin holding hours of footage that had no clear origin, no registered copyright, and no artistic signature. The one labeled 10/14/22 Mason was prioritized first. Inside the projection bay, a forensic archivist named Ellie Cruz, a specialist in analog media recovery and film deconstruction, began the slow process of decoding what lay inside. What she found was unlike anything she had ever handled. The footage opened in near darkness. Mason stood barefoot on a concrete floor, shoulders tense, eyes darting, as if waiting for something off-screen. He was dressed in the same hoodie he had worn the night he vanished, now visibly stretched and soiled. The audio track was warped and nearly inaudible, a series of mechanical clicks and distant breathing sounds layered beneath the grain. Mason began pacing, slowly at first, then with sudden bursts of speed. His steps followed no rhythm. He would stop abruptly, mutter something unintelligible, then resume, over and over. At times he flinched as if reacting to invisible cues. His posture was stiff but not restrained, like someone trying to obey rules that changed with every movement. At the 11-minute mark, the footage shifted abruptly, not forward but backward. The same sequence began replaying in reverse, but the anomalies multiplied. Mason's reflection on the two-way glass wall would move just milliseconds ahead of him, anticipating his next gesture. In one sequence, he mouthed a sentence, but the audio played the phrase backward before his lips moved at all. Slowing the reel revealed the phrase to be, "Not me, not mine, not now." Ellie flagged it for psychological profiling. When she moved on to the other reels, Lila, Aiden, Eric, a pattern emerged. Each subject appeared in similar conditions, isolated, barefoot, disoriented. Each reel included at least one stretch of reversed footage, looped sequences of speech fragments, and repeated physical gestures. Most subjects appeared to be teenagers, between 15 and 18. Cross-referencing their first names and reel dates with national missing persons databases confirmed at least 4 of them had been declared missing in different states between 2016 and 2021. None had been found, none had been linked before. The similarity between the recordings was unnerving. The pacing, the repetition, the visible distress layered over apparent obedience, but it wasn't theater. There were no scripts, no scenes, no narrative. It was exposure, conditioning. Designed to wear something down. A behavioral psychologist brought in to consult described it as looped imprinting, an archaic form of psychological programming rooted in trauma repetition. When paired with sensory distortion, such as infrasound or visual strobe manipulation, the brain's perception of time and self begins to dissolve. Thoughts become fragmented. Speech devolves into borrowed language. In short, identity, when subjected to enough fragmentation, becomes susceptible to overwrite. One chilling detail connected every reel. At some point in each recording, the subject would stop, look directly into the camera, and repeat a phrase, always different, but always spoken in a tone that didn't match their effect. Mason's was, "I remember what you forgot." Lila's was, "I woke up as her." Aiden's whispered, "Don't rewind me." Experts began referring to the tapes as mirror trauma loops, not because they used mirrors, but because they mirrored suffering back at the subject repeatedly until it no longer belonged to them. But the biggest anomaly was still Mason's. Unlike the others, his reel showed stages, gradual shifts in posture, language, responsiveness. In early sequences, he was resistant. He paced aggressively, muttered in protest, flinched at cues. Midway through the tape, his speech fractured. Words became sounds, movement slowed. In the final 5 minutes he stood still, arms slack at his sides, watching his own reflection through the glass. He no longer spoke. He just mimicked. A blink, a tilt, a twitch, every action mirrored back and forth until it became impossible to tell which side was reacting first. And then came the last frame, a sudden burst of overexposure. The screen flared white, and for a single moment, just one frame, the footage reversed fully. Mason, reflected in the two-way glass, smiled. Not broadly, not warmly, just enough to register. The real Mason did not. The smile belonged to the reflection. The implication was sickening. Somehow, the mirrored identity had become dominant. That single frame was sent to Quantico's psychological analysis team. Their early hypothesis was unprecedented. They believed the footage was part of a behavioral override attempt, an effort to fracture identity through repetition and restructure it using mirrored behavioral cues. The mirrored Mason, they said, was not just symbolic, it was functional. The reflection, trained over weeks or months to anticipate, respond, and eventually replace, it wasn't brainwashing in the traditional sense. It was more like formatting, taking a person's psychological operating system and replacing it with one written by someone else. Whoever designed the loop room hadn't just wanted to film fear. They wanted to reproduce it, calibrate it, imprint it. And with each reel recovered, it became clearer that Mason hadn't been the first, but he might be the first one still alive. The deeper investigators pushed into Ezra Lamb's history, the more the narrative began to unravel. What started as a search for a reclusive student turned into something stranger, something that no longer made sense within the boundaries of academia or independent filmmaking. Wexler College's records, initially believed to document Ezra's enrollment, revealed a critical inconsistency. While he had been present in countless student projects and was listed as studio assistant in archived lab notes, there was no official record of his admission. He had never been registered as a student. Not in film, not in media studies, not at all. Instead, further digging uncovered something that had been overlooked in the fire-damaged archives. Ezra had been a teaching assistant, not for a film professor, but for a visiting adjunct named Howard Mayfield, a neuroscientist by training with a long and quiet history in experimental media. Mayfield had arrived at Wexler in 2010 under a temporary research grant aimed at exploring sensorial conditioning in immersive environments. His prior work, most of it unpublished, suggested a fascination with how sound and imagery could bypass conscious processing and affect memory directly. A former colleague described him as brilliant but obsessive. He didn't want to film stories, she said. He wanted to film experiences, the kind that change you without you knowing. By 2012, Mayfield had transitioned entirely into visual media, abandoning his neuroscience affiliations. Under the guise of media research, he had reportedly begun filming anonymous volunteers in closed environments, subjecting them to repeating stimuli. Images of their own faces, spliced audio loops, variable light exposure, and long durations of silent observation. A few of the early participants reported insomnia and dissociation afterward. 2 dropped out of the program entirely. No formal complaints were filed, and the university quietly ended the study that spring. Months later, the fire consumed the media archives building. Ezra Lamb vanished, and so, it was assumed, did Howard Mayfield. But that assumption was wrong. A long-buried insurance document revealed something odd. While Ezra's belongings were never recovered, Howard Mayfield's were, at least in part, a burnt ID card, a charred lab coat, a fragment of his hard drive. Enough to identify a body, if a body had ever been found. But the remains believed to be his were never conclusively matched. There had been no autopsy, no dental confirmation, just circumstantial attribution, approved quickly in the chaos following the fire. When investigators re-examined the timeline, a disturbing theory emerged. Mayfield had faked his death using Ezra's identity. Or perhaps Ezra had been a fabricated persona all along, a name to shield the real mind behind the project. Either way, the man who had disappeared in 2012 wasn't a burned-out student with a flair for the unsettling. He was a trained neuroscientist with a documented obsession, one who had slipped through the cracks and taken his research underground. Archived drafts of Mayfield's early papers painted a clearer picture. In one, he described a theory he called fear transference through visual encoding. The idea was as disturbing as it was abstract. Fear, he claimed, could be captured, not metaphorically, but neurologically, through the right combination of audio and image exposure. If a subject could be conditioned to respond viscerally to a particular sequence, and that sequence recorded, then the fear response could be reproduced in another viewer. Not just understood, but felt. It wasn't just about scaring someone, it was about embedding emotion, like data, transferring it like a virus. Mayfield's method relied on disorientation, repetition, and a breakdown of identity, the very ingredients found in the loop room footage. He believed identity itself was a kind of narrative, one that could be rewritten if fragmented properly. And the ultimate goal of his project, according to one unpublished grant application, was to create what he called a psychocinematic feedback loop, a film that didn't just depict fear, but reproduced it in the viewer and then reinforced it in the subject being filmed. The Mirror Room, it seemed, had been the first complete version of that experiment. The title wasn't artistic. It was literal. The room reflected fear, not back at the subject, but into the viewer. A loop designed to strip away the boundary between the two. A confidential report circulated within the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit warned of the implications. If Mayfield was still alive, and if he had continued refining his process, he could have used multiple volunteers or victims across the last decade, filming them, breaking them, and recording their responses for eventual replication. And if the Mirror Room was his final product, Mason Rourke wasn't a casualty. He was a conduit, a vessel through which Mayfield's years of experimentation had culminated. Some agents began referring to Mayfield only as the director, not out of reverence, out of fear, because what he had created wasn't just a film, it was a tool, a psychological trap set inside a reel of flickering light. And the worst part? They still didn't know where he was. On October 14, 2024, 2 years to the day since Mason Rourke vanished from Theater 3, a plain cardboard package arrived at the Brookhaven Police Department's front desk with no return address. It was hand-delivered, the clerk said, by someone in a navy hoodie and sunglasses who never spoke, never signed, and was gone before she even looked up from logging it in. The package was unmarked, except for a single word stamped in red on the side, "Rewind." Inside was a black plastic VHS case, pristine, without scratches or wear. Taped to the front was a white label reading, "The Mirror Room, Final Cut." The words were typed in all caps, spaced evenly, but the ink bled faintly around the letters, as if printed with outdated ribbon. Tucked behind the case was a folded sheet of paper, blank except for a date, 10/14/22, and a time, 12:03 a.m. That timestamp had become a scar on the investigation. It was the exact moment the surveillance footage in Theater 3 cut out 2 years ago. The same length as the lost reel. The same moment Mason disappeared. A special viewing was arranged at the FBI's Digital Media Lab under controlled conditions. Analysts prepared for another round of audio manipulation or visual distortion. The room was sound insulated, the playback equipment disconnected from external systems, and the film was run through a digitization rig first to avoid any interaction with vintage electronics. Still, what played was not what anyone expected. The tape began with static, short, sharp bursts before fading into the opening frame. A single shot of the loop room, empty, dimly lit, its padded walls and flickering bulb instantly familiar. The perspective was from a fixed angle, unmoving. After 13 seconds, a figure entered from the left side of the frame. Mason, he was older. Noticeably thinner, hair overgrown and matted, eyes hollowed. His movements were slow but deliberate, as though conditioned into ritual. He stood silently for several seconds before sitting in the familiar chair at the room's center, the one investigators had found bolted to the floor 2 years earlier. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply stared forward. The timestamp in the corner read 10/14/24, 12:03 a.m. The tape continued for 15 minutes with no cuts, no music, no voice. Just the faint sound of the bulb above him flickering. Then, without warning, the footage froze, and the tape began to rewind on its own. Not mechanically, not in the way old VHS tapes used to spool back, but cinematically. The image reversed, slowly at first, frame by frame. Mason's actions played backward, but with one critical difference: his eyes remained locked on the camera. Even as his body moved in reverse, his stare did not break. It was impossible, physically unnatural. Yet there it was. As the reverse playback continued, Mason's mouth began to move, slowly, silently, as if speaking backwards while the world flowed around him, his body motion no longer aligned with his expression. At the 37-minute mark, the tape reached a segment where Mason, in reverse, stood up and backed out of frame. But his reflection, barely visible in the mirrored glass behind the chair, remained seated. And then, in the middle of that reflection, his mouth moved forward. Clearly, unmistakably mouthing 3 words. Don't stop the tape. Technicians froze the frame. They zoomed in, enhanced it, confirmed it wasn't a glitch or audio overlay. No sound played, just the image of a boy who hadn't been seen in 2 years, now gaunt and ghost-like, pleading through a mirror that wasn't supposed to show anything at all. A reflection left behind. Experts debated whether the footage was real-time or previously recorded. There was no film grain degradation, no compression loss, no timestamps embedded in the frame's metadata. It was clean, too clean, as if freshly produced, as if meant to be seen now, and only now. A side-by-side comparison with the original loop room footage confirmed it was the same space. But new scratches had appeared on the walls. One phrase, repeated in fresh etching across the frame behind Mason's chair: rewind to become. Analysts proposed theories that Mayfield had orchestrated the tape as a psychological trigger, a signal for the next phase of his experiment. That Mason had been kept alive and filmed repeatedly in different conditions, spliced into layers of footage meant to mirror dissociation and reprogramming. That the reflection was not Mason at all, but an image fed back to him, looped so long it had learned how to act independently. A few, though, took the warning seriously. They argued that if the tape was designed as a loop, not just of image, but of time, emotion, and perception, then stopping it could interrupt the fragile thread tethering Mason's reality to his own consciousness. That perhaps wherever he was, however altered he had become, this film was the only means of communicating his presence back. The lead investigator, against protocol, played the remaining 10 minutes of the tape in full. It concluded with a static shot of the loop room, once again empty. The lights dimmed. A chair, slightly off-center, no movement, no sound. Then, one final flicker, a frame spliced into the end, no more than a half-second long, a close-up of Mason's face. His eyes were open, staring, unblinking. But the mouth in the image? It wasn't his. It was smiling. The breakthrough didn't come from a direct confession, a dramatic witness tip, or even a digital trace. It came from wallpaper. In the paused footage of the mirror room, final cut, when Mason's reflection mouthed those haunting words, "Don't stop the tape," a sliver of the room's corner came into focus. Behind him, faint but unmistakable, was a degraded strip of floral wallpaper. The pattern was specific: dull blue roses in a diamond lattice, flanked by beige vines. A specialist in institutional architecture recognized it immediately. It matched a discontinued style used in a now-demolished dormitory complex at Wexler College, the same university where the fire that allegedly killed Ezra Lamb had burned through the media archives 12 years earlier. But what the school had called a demolition in its official report had, in fact, been a partial condemnation. While the upper floors had been destroyed and sealed off, blueprints revealed an old sub-basement, a forgotten floor buried beneath the reconstruction. It had once served as a storage and lab space for the experimental media department. The space had been deemed inaccessible, structurally unstable. It had never been formally cleared. That was enough. On October 16, 2024, 2 days after the arrival of the VHS tape, a federal tactical team was deployed to the site. With the coordination of the state police and fire marshal, they breached the rusted sub-basement door just after dawn. What they found beyond the threshold was not the crumbling decay of an abandoned university floor. It was a bunker, functional, controlled, and alive. The air inside was cold, metallic, and heavy with the scent of old chemicals and electrical heat. The first room was lined with analog monitors stacked in uneven towers, each screen flickering in grainy black and white. Some displayed static, others looped footage of sleeping subjects, of blank hallways, of someone brushing their teeth or sitting perfectly still at the edge of a bed. In one corner, a metal table was littered with spliced film reels, editing blades, and handwritten logs documenting sleep cycles, voice patterns, eye dilation, and mirror response latency. The next room was worse. It had been a living chamber, mattress on the floor, a single sink, walls covered in reflective foil, and strips of distorted VHS stills, all featuring the same figure over and over. Mason Rourke, eating, sleeping, staring at the wall, his image captured at all angles, catalogued obsessively. And in the far corner, humming steadily, a 16mm projector ran in an endless loop. The reel wasn't just the mirror room. It had been altered. Spliced between the original distorted imagery were newer segments, color footage of Mason's daily routines, filmed in the very room they now stood in. Him brushing his teeth, him whispering in the dark, him watching himself sleep. But now, in the final chamber, a sealed room behind a steel door marked with a faded label reading Projection A, they found him. Mason Rourke was slumped in a padded chair, his eyes half-lidded, body still. He was alive, but sedated. Electrodes taped to his neck and arms had long dried, their wires dangling from a rusted control board beside him. His hair had grown past his shoulders, his frame thin but intact. He did not react to the officers at first, but only blinked, slow and confused, as if surfacing from a dream. A medic checked his vitals, stable, breathing, faint but present. The room itself was lined with more film canisters, newer ones, dated through 2023 and into late 2024. All were labeled with variations of the same title: Rehearsal, Repeat, Response. On the far wall, someone had written in chalk, "When the loop perfects the subject becomes the loop." And then, footsteps. From a hallway that hadn't been cleared yet, someone ran, fast, barefoot, the slap of skin against linoleum echoing off the tile. Officers gave chase and cornered the figure 2 levels above ground, trying to climb through an old maintenance shaft. He was masked, wearing a hood, his body thin and wiry. When tackled, he struggled but didn't speak. His fingers were ink-stained, under his fingernails, adhesive residue consistent with film splice tape. In his back pocket, a broken reel labeled Mason Final Mirror. At the station, fingerprinting confirmed what few had dared to assume: Howard Mayfield, alive. Still operating under pseudonyms, still refining his mirror trauma loops in silence. He had not only faked his death, he had evolved his experiments beyond what even investigators had theorized. For years, he had moved through small college towns, recruiting, observing, filming. But Mason had been different. Mason, it seemed, had resisted. And the tape, the one labeled Final Cut, had not been a victory lap. It had been a warning, a message. Back at the hospital, Mason began to speak. Quietly, one word at a time. No full memories, no dramatic recounting, just fragments. The lights? Backwards. He showed me myself until I stopped knowing which one I was. When shown a mirror, he turned away. But when the projector in his room was turned off, his eyes finally filled with tears. He was coming back, frame by frame. He called himself Julian Krell. That was the name on the fake ID. It was on the lease agreements, the burner phones, the alias linked to shell corporations that quietly rented projection rooms in post offices up and down the eastern seaboard. But his fingerprints told a different story. His real name was Howard Mayfield. Former neuroscientist, experimental media researcher, presumed dead since 2012. When confronted with the evidence, Mayfield didn't deny who he was. He simply asked a question. Did the tape stop? In the weeks following his arrest, Mayfield was held in a federal facility under high psychological observation. The interrogation team approached him cautiously, unsure whether he was delusional or calculated. And what they found was a man entirely convinced that what he'd done was not criminal, but revolutionary. In hours of recorded interviews, he explained his beliefs in unsettling detail. He didn't see his project as torture. He saw it as proof of concept. Fear, he said, is the most stable emotional molecule. It preserves better than memory. According to Mayfield, the mirror room wasn't a film. It was a mechanism, a tool designed to extract, isolate, and imprint trauma from one human consciousness into another through audio-visual fidelity. The loop room was not about performance or documentation. It was about erosion. The subject, in this case, Mason, was meant to be stripped of self, rebuilt by reflection, then observed until the original identity ceased to resist. Every frame is a suggestion, Mayfield said. When played enough, it becomes the only memory the mind can trust. He spoke of Mason not as a victim, but as a vessel. Someone he believed had achieved the highest threshold of loop response, someone who had begun to rehearse fear on his own without prompting. The final tape, he claimed, was Mason's own creation. He needed the world to see what he'd become. The real spoke for him. None of it changed what came next. Mayfield was charged with multiple counts of unlawful confinement, aggravated assault, and conspiracy across state lines. More charges followed as investigators connected his movements to other disappearances linked to his early experiments. His trial would take months, if not years. But the most important part of the story didn't unfold in a courtroom. It unfolded slowly, quietly, in the recovery ward of a trauma rehabilitation center 4 hours north of Brookhaven, where Mason Rourke was learning how to live again. At first, Mason spoke in fragments, sometimes in past tense, sometimes in second person, like he was narrating someone else's life. He flinched when lights flickered. Mirrors were covered in every room he slept in. He often asked if he was still being recorded, even when alone. But week by week, word by word, he began to return to himself. With therapy, structure, and relentless patience, he started to share what he remembered. He remembered being filmed constantly, not just watched, filmed, every gesture recorded, every hesitation looped back at him. Mayfield would replay footage in front of him, sometimes reversed, sometimes overlaid with his own voice, asking questions he never remembered answering. Time bled into itself. He was made to watch his own breakdown until it felt like it belonged to someone else. He was told to mimic it, refuse it, then accept it again. Until the loop wasn't just playing on the screen, it was playing inside him. He described moments of waking up not knowing if he was still Mason or just the character Mayfield wanted him to become. He stopped trusting his own memories. He stopped trusting silence. And the worst part, he said, was that after a while, he stopped resisting, not because he agreed, but because he couldn't remember how not to. When asked about the final tape, the one that arrived 2 years to the day after his disappearance, Mason didn't recognize all of it, but he remembered recording parts of it, alone, unwatched. He said he waited until Mayfield was asleep, rewound the projector manually, and whispered the line, "Don't stop the tape." It wasn't a threat. It was a breadcrumb, and it worked. The Majestic Theater was condemned and demolished within weeks of the final raid. Its gutted foundation revealed nothing else. No hidden rooms, no further evidence. But investigators confirmed the loop room below had been soundproofed so effectively that none of its activities could have been detected even during the original searches. The building's last surviving feature, the metal marquee frame, was removed and stored in evidence. Every known copy of the mirror room, along with its variant reels and spliced sequences, was seized and incinerated under federal supervision. The master tape, the one labeled Final Cut, was the last to be destroyed. But before it was reduced to ash, Mason was given the choice to see it one last time. He refused. On a crisp morning in late spring, Mason Rourke stood on the rooftop garden of his recovery center and watched the sunrise. It was quiet, still. For the first time in over 2 years, there was no loop, no reflection, no recording light humming in the background, just air, just warmth. just the sound of a world that didn't need to rewind. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because for the first time in years, the tape had finally stopped.